Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
Far from wanting to arm their slaves, Southern planters were deeply concerned about squashing any possible slave revolts while so many white men were away at war. For over a century, plantation owners had worked to restrict the movement of slaves and, generally, free blacks through slave patrols. These patrols were either formal or informal police groups consisting of white men from all ranks of society. During the war, with so many white men away in the army, the regular patrols were often supplemented with local militia or even light cavalry units from the Confederate Army. But slaves did not necessarily welcome the arrival of Northern troops. As the 1919 Journal of Negro History reported, to the majority of the Negroes, as to all the South, the invading armies of the Union seemed to be ruthlessly attacking independent states, invading the beloved homeland and trampling upon all that these men held dear. Former slave Jasper Battle of Georgia explained,
"Them Yankees was polite like, and they never borrowed nothing on our place, but they just plumb ruined everything some of their plantations right close to ourn. They took near everything some of our neighbors had to eat, most all their good horses, and everything else they wanted."
But other slaves had a much different experience. Mary Anderson of North Carolina described the arrival of Yankees on her owner's plantation.
In about an hour, there was one of the blackest clouds coming up the avenue from the main road. It was the Yankee soldiers. They finally filled the mile-long avenue, reaching from Master's house to the main road and spread over the mile-square grove. The mounted men dismounted. The footmen stacked their shiny guns and began to build fires and cooked. They called the slaves saying, "You are free." Slaves were whooping and laughing and acting like they were crazy. Yankee soldiers were shaking hands with Negroes and calling them Sam, Dinah, Sarah, and asking them questions. The Yankees told them to come on and join them. They were free. Masters and misses sat on the porch, and they were so humble, no Yankee bothered anything in the great house. The slaves were awfully excited. The Yankees stayed there, cooked, eat, and drank, and played music until about night. Then a bugle began to blow, and you never saw such getting on horses and lining up in your life. In a few minutes, they began to march, leaving the grove, which was soon as silent as a graveyard. When they left the country, a lot of them slaves went with them, and soon there were no masters' slaves left.
Many slaves did run off and join the Union forces, either to build fortifications or to become soldiers themselves. Many in the North objected to Lincoln's proclamation. They believed the war was being fought to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. Indeed, that had long been Lincoln's message. Lincoln had become convinced that emancipation of slaves held in the rebel states served the war effort by depriving the Confederacy of their labor. Every slave who raised crops to feed the armies, built fortifications to defend them, or performed countless other non-combat duties, freed a white man to carry arms against the Union. Even many of his generals disagreed, including Major General George McClellan, who had been Lincoln's general-in-chief earlier in the war. Some Union generals did not wait for the public or the president to decide the time was right for enlisting and arming former slaves and free blacks. In the spring of 1862, General David Hunter created a regiment of African-American soldiers composed of former slaves. But many legislators were not ready for such actions. Representative Charles Wickliffe of Kentucky demanded that General Hunter explain his conduct in turning fugitive slaves into soldiers. General Hunter responded by letter.
I reply that no regiment of fugitive slaves has been or is being organized in this department. There is, however, a fine regiment of persons whose late masters are fugitive rebels, men who everywhere fly before the appearance of the national flag, leaving their servants behind them to shift as best they can for themselves. So far, indeed, are the loyal persons composing this regiment from seeking to avoid the presence of their late owners that they are now, one and all, working with remarkable industry to place themselves in a position to go in full and effective pursuit of their fugacious and traitorous proprietors. It is the masters who have in every instance been the fugitives, running away from loyal slaves as well as loyal soldiers, and whom we have only partially been able to see, chiefly their heads over ramparts or rifle in hand dodging behind trees in the extreme distance. In the absence of any fugitive master law, the deserted slaves would be wholly without remedy, had not the crime of treason given them the right to pursue, capture, and bring back those persons whose protection they have been thus suddenly bereft. The experiment of arming the blacks, so far as I have made it, has been a complete and even marvelous success.
Hunter's success, and Butler's, would encourage the President and others to officially begin enlisting African-American soldiers into the Union Army. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, recruitment of black soldiers began in earnest. Known as the United States Colored Troops, black regiments of all types, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, were recruited from across the United States. Nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the colored troops, which represented about 10% of the Union's total forces at the end of the war. One African American soldier is better known for her activities before the war. Harriet Tubman, famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, served the Union in the Civil War in many capacities: nurse, scout, spy, and raider. In June 1863, Harriet Tubman worked with Colonel James Montgomery under General Hunter to plan and execute a raid on Confederate stockpiles. Tubman initially scouted the area and then led Montgomery and his black troops on gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina. When they reached the plantations holding the stockpiles, they met little resistance. After confiscating rice, corn, cotton, and livestock, they set fire to what they could not carry. They then set about freeing slaves in the area. Over 700 slaves were gathered up from the surrounding plantations and evacuated to freedom. In July 1863, two incidents, one tragic and one heroic, highlighted the role of the U.S. colored troops. The tragedy was the draft riot in New York City. The draft was terrifically unpopular, and Democrat newspapers linked the draft directly to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Editorials warned that white men were being drafted to fight and die on behalf of blacks. Tensions rose, and on July 13th, they bubbled over. For 4 days, mobs raged through the city, attacking draft offices, federal buildings, and of course, black people. The property of black citizens was smashed or burned. Several blacks were lynched, and the Colored Orphans Asylum was burned to the ground. The mob violence only ended after federal troops opened fire on the rioters on July 15th and 16th. Meanwhile, one regiment of U.S. colored troops was preparing for an attack that would earn it a place in history. Made famous in the 1989 movie Glory, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment led an assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. The 54th lost almost half its men, including its white commanding officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, son of a prominent abolitionist. But they demonstrated a level of courage and fighting spirit that was the equal of any fighting unit in the Union Army and gained instant respect in the eyes of the nation. The reality of black soldiers dying on behalf of the Union while rioters attacked and murdered blacks in the streets caused many to reevaluate their position on African American enlistment. But in truth, African American troops had already proven themselves in combat. General Butler's Louisiana regiments, along with other troops under Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, attacked a Confederate fortification at Port Hudson, Mississippi. 10 days later, another 3 regiments of African American troops fought a major defensive action to protect General Grant's supply line during his siege of Vicksburg. This time, the black Union soldiers were not well-trained troops like the Louisiana Native Guard. Instead, these 1,250 men were ex-slaves of Louisiana and Mississippi and had been formed into regiments just 2 weeks earlier. They lacked training or sufficient weaponry when they were attacked by twice their number of Confederates at Milliken's Bend. One observer wrote of the black troops in the battle,
"They railed and charged the enemy more heroically and desperately than has been recorded during the war. It was a genuine bayonet charge, a hand-to-hand fight that has never occurred to any extent during this prolonged conflict. Upon both sides, men were killed with the butts of muskets, white and black men were lying side by side, pierced by bayonets, and in some instances transfixed to the earth. In one instance, 2 men, one white and the other black, were found dead side by side, each having the other's bayonet through his body."
39% of the black soldiers at Milliken's Bend were killed or wounded in that battle. But they managed to drive off the rebels and maintain Grant's line of supply.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.